right, I'm letting folks in. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi,
Good evening.
Christy.
Hi, Essie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome.
Who all's here?
Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you'd like. No pressure, but it's always nice to see people's beautiful faces. We'll give folks a couple minutes to trickle in. Thanks for being here. Welcome. Oh, so fun to see people rolling in. Welcome, folks who are just joining.
Nice.
Feel free to take a minute, settle in, maybe grab a beverage, grab some nosh. It's dinner time here in Chicago. I know folks are joining us from all over. Maybe it's not dinner time where you are. Maybe it's snack time.
For me in Tasmania and Australia. So I'm here.
Classy.
Totally. I'm in the north of Tasmania.
It's a great place.
It's really cool.
Thanks for being here. Hi, y'all. We're just letting folks trickle in. We'll get started in probably another minute or so. You're invited to have your camera on if you'd like, no pressure. We've got some puppies with us, so sweet.
Hi, Black Lab.
All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and start talking. Folks can keep trickling in. But welcome. Thank you so much for being here. This is Getting Your Kinks In, Neurodiversity and BDSM. I'm really excited that you're here. I'm going to take a few moments just to orient you to the space and to go over some housekeeping items, and then I will introduce our speakers and hand it over to them. So for those who don't know me, I'm Essie Shachar-Hell. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the programs manager at LifeWorks Psychotherapy. And LifeWorks is the therapy practice here in Chicago that sponsors KPACT. If you're new to the community, KPACT stands for Kink and Polyamory Aware Chicago Therapists. KPACT was founded in 2014, and it's a community of mental health practitioners in the Chicagoland area, mostly, who serve kinky, polyamorous, and sex worker clients, and who are committed to ongoing learning and professional development around clinical work with these populations. KPACT is a supportive network of therapists who want to be connected to like-minded clinicians. KPACT sponsors professional development events like the one this evening, as well as hosting a private Google group for clinicians. A quick plug for some upcoming KPACT events. Our next KPACT training is going to be virtual on July 7th on the topic of decolonizing kink. And our fall event is going to be on October 13th on partner surrogacy. You can find more information on our website, which is kpact.xyz, which I'll drop in the chat in a second, or by emailing me directly. I also want to make a quick plug that LifeWorks Psychotherapy, which sponsors KPACT, is hiring. We're hiring a full-time clinician. So if you are looking for a supportive practice that values professional and personal growth and focuses on serving LGBTQ, kinky, polyamorous, and sex worker clients, please check out our position opening. I will also drop that link in the chat when I stop talking, which will be soon. A couple logistics for the evening. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the presentation. Both our presenters are really happy to answer questions organically as they arise, so you can pop those in the chat. There will also be time for discussion, so you can know that that is coming, and there will be space for discussion then as well. If you're having any tech issues or questions, you can send a private chat to me. And I just ask that you keep yourself muted unless you're speaking to help us reduce the background noise. This event is being recorded, so we will send out the recording afterwards, but it's also good to keep in mind that it's being recorded when we are in discussion, possibly talking about clinical material or cases. If we need to, we can pause the recording when we get to the discussion, if we need to do that. If you would like to receive continuing education units for this event, please fill out the CE survey that I will drop in the chat at the end of the event within 1 week. And I will also send that survey via email when I send out the event recording. Okay, so now that I've gabbed your ears off, I'm excited to introduce you to tonight's presenters, Stephen Radcliffe and Eve Minax. Stephen Ratcliffe is a licensed professional counselor and certified sex therapist. He has worked for over 17 years in the social services field. Steve received his master's degree in clinical psychology in 2009 at Wheaton College here in Illinois, and he also completed a graduate certificate program in human sexuality at Southwestern College in 2020. He is currently studying clinical psychology in the Doctor of Psychology degree program at California Southern University with a focus on gender, sexual, and relationship diversity populations and consensual non-monogamy. Eve Minax has studied in the US, France, and Australia and holds an MA in French and English literatures with a concentration in feminist studies. She has also studied at the Cleo Dubois Academy of SM Arts, where she honed her extensive BDSM skills and now acts as a lead staff instructor. She is also a bondage practitioner and holds a sex education certification from San Francisco Sex Information. She has completed over 300 hours of alternative sexuality workshops at various conferences, in addition to teaching a multitude of classes. Welcome, Eve and Steve.
Welcome, everybody. All right, so tonight, last time we taught this, I think we had about 7 hours over 2 days, or 8 hours over 2 days. And so y'all are going to get a very condensed fire hose version of things. We tried to cut out some slides. I ended up adding some slides because I don't know how not to info dump. And so we're going to spend the first hour info dumping about ADHD and enjoying a little bit of distraction and enjoying some stimming. And after that, Eve will lead us in kind of a discussion of how kink can facilitate wellness with kind of a show and tell, some really fun kinky photos. And in the second hour, we'll do the same dance with autism. So we're focusing on 2 types of neurodivergence. Our learning objectives, we would like you to be able to understand some of the clinical concerns and potential coping skills implicit in kink for both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder folks. Neither I or Eve have any industry funding, conflict of interest to disclose. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I live on stolen and colonized land of the Chinook. And Eve, you live on, do you want to do your land acknowledgement?
I live on the stolen and colonized land of the Ohlone and the Ramaytush peoples.
Thank you. I think last time we did this, I just butchered the name, so thank you for helping me out. So let's dive right in. And again, I didn't put this in, but I like to think about accommodations. If you want to say something, but you don't feel comfortable interrupting, put your hand up. I have a second mirror behind, a second screen behind, so I can see everybody. And if I see a hand raised, I'll stop. If you don't feel comfortable talking, put it in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable bringing up your point here, we're going to have our contact information at the end. Please email us. We enjoy dialogue about these things. So let's talk about ADHD. But before we do that, let's talk about neurodivergence. So neurodivergence is an emerging term to encapsulate a lot of differences in neurotype or differences in the way people are cognitively structured. This can include people with autism, ADHD, highly sensitive people. Some people will include depression or OCD or other kinds of things under this archetype. Many of these types of neurodivergence co-occur and occur in a spectrum, thinking again that DSM-5 spectrum for all of our diagnoses. And the idea of neurodivergence is that we're trying to support a non-pathologizing view of ADHD and autism, that these are differences in the way people are neurologically kind of born and not problems. Others would, so these are diversities. The people who are not neurodivergent would be seen as neurotypical or allistic. So these are people who their brain wiring more closely resembles mainstream population. I was actually in a discussion with a colleague earlier today who we both are really just for geeking ourselves the fuck out about kink and neurodivergence. And we're like, is anybody really neurotypical though? Like the more we think about it, like I just don't know where these mythical neurotypicals are, because but anyway. We also want to avoid functioning labels because these have been harmful. That's part of why autism in particular shifted to 3 levels in the diagnostic system of support needed instead of functioning levels. Neurodiversity is variations in types. So we've got some graphs here to the right of your screen to kind of illustrate that. Others would argue instead of neurodivergence to use neuroemergence to think about ADHD and autism variations as an evolutionary adaptation. There's a really cute alien film recently that also played off of this, and the autistic kid was the one the aliens wanted to abduct because he was superpower special. Others like neurospicy, but in this presentation, we're going to use neurodivergent to mean specifically ADHD and autism. My buddy earlier had said, it's kind of like those are our siblings in a family in a lot of ways, because there's a lot of overlap. There's some studies that suggest some genetic similarities between autism and ADHD. In terms of language, preferences vary. There's been a big move toward identity first language, so an autistic person or an ADHD person instead of, or identity first instead of person first. And so we're going to mirror that here. Some argue that identity first language is less stigmatizing. Others, argue for different things. My contention is here we're going to use identity first because that seems to be what people like the most. But in your own clinical practice, mirror your clients. They are the experts on what they like to be called. So why? Oh, wait. Yes, we're going to have some discussion. This means we get to talk about this. Why do y'all think there's an overlap between ADHD/autism and kink? This training kind of grew out of our observation, looking around the room in kinky spaces and saying, there's a lot of folks like me with ADHD or autism. What's going on here? Who are kinky? So why do y'all think there's this overlap? Sensory experiences, somatic relationships, say more. What do we mean? Sensory play. It's fun. There's lots to explore. Clear rules and boundaries. Okay. Love of novelty. All right. Being able to communicate. Novelty, dopamine seeking. Okay. Yeah, rules, varying degrees of intimacy. Structure. Lots of good reasons. Anybody else want to cue in or talk about this, or Okay, different way. All right. So we're going to come back to this later, but our fundamental premise is, again, one of non-pathologizing. And so we are arguing that, kinky folks are not any more pathological, that this overlap between ADHD and autism is not a pathologizing thing. And we pull back on a growing body of research that finds that there's not greater psychopathology in kinky populations. No greater incidence of OCD, PTSD, anxious attachment, rejection tolerance, anxiety, depression. And while we do see that higher rate of suicidality in kink populations, these parallel rates seen in LGBTQ populations. And so that supports the interpretation that if we think based upon like Myers minority stress theory, the stressors of being a minority, or what I prefer to call a diverse population that goes against the mainstream norms, and those experiences of prejudice and stigma and discrimination can influence people, and it can increase suicidality. And that's certainly what we see in LGBTQ populations, and it's interesting that Kink kind of mirrors that. All right. So ADHD is a lot of different things beyond just fidgeting and getting distracted. We're going to do some review of some basics of ADHD before we talk about the overlap a little bit more. But ADHD is a developmental disorder characterized by was there something somebody was saying? Okay. By struggles sustaining attention to some tasks, inattention, spacing out, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and variations. And of course, there's lots of different ways it can look. It can look different in adults. Hyperactivity sometimes is more like restlessness or being really active. ADHD and the DSM-5, the American Diagnostic System, and the ICD-11, the one the rest of the world uses, are very similar. There's lots of overlap. One of the major changes in the DSM-5 was the removal of the stipulation that ADHD and autism could not be concurrently diagnosed. And as we know, there's a lot of people that are doubly spicy that have ADHD and autism both. And that was very validating that qualifier was removed. Okay. And then multiple sources of information are encouraged. Prevalence, generally, it's one of the more common neurodevelopmental disorders in children with a worldwide prevalence of around 5%. We do see that 5% showing up in replication in different countries. There's some different disagreement about why that is. Some people say that's just America colonially spreading our media and our way of being and our way of interpreting things to other countries. But it does seem to be, if we take this at face value, it does seem to be pretty biologically based when we see that kind of consistency from country to country. ADHD symptoms persist in adulthood in about 65% of cases. What that means is that some people seem to age out of ADHD, and what's probably happening is they're just getting really damn good at masking. And so, who can tell me what masking is? What am I talking about? I could be really sadistic and call on somebody.
Hi, this is Jenny.
Hi, Jenny.
I think you're referring to covering up symptoms or difficulties using conscious strategies and taking energy to do so.
Yes, you read my mind. Yes, that is exactly what I'm talking about. So a lot of people come up with ways to compensate for their ADHD. And that's what we believe why some people seem to kind of age out. They had these symptoms in childhood and adulthood. They're now finding ways to compensate with that. Maybe they're drinking copious amounts of caffeine every day, and they are, really physically active, or different things to kind of self-medicate. Despite a reduction in the number of symptoms over development, adults with ADHD, and children can both still present with impairment. There is some sex differences and variations, and what we don't know is whether this is from kind of sexist diagnostic criteria. In my own clinical practice, I see a lot of AFAB people, assigned female at birth, who I'm just assuming that we're all speaking the same language. So if I'm speaking out some shit and y'all don't know what I'm talking about, please raise your hand or throw something at me digitally. But a lot of people, assigned female at birth are less likely to be diagnosed because they tend to have had societal pressures to mask earlier. But generally, the people who actually do get the privilege of a diagnosis, it's 2 to 1 males to females. So AMAB people are getting much more commonly diagnosed. And, that's definitely a problem with our diagnostic criteria. Again, review of biology and etiology. Current research suggests a pretty strong biological component in ADHD. It's one of the more genetically based diagnoses in our system. Heritability is estimated between 60 and 90%. That means that it tends to follow in families. It's one of the interesting things that's emerging from more recent neurological research is that ADHD, we no longer think of it as a dysfunction in one part of the brain, but it's in networks of the brain. And there's, again, some research emerging to talk about the relationship between genetic and environmental variables. And in terms of aging, the burden of illness in older adults with ADHD appears to be a little bit older, a little bit higher. One of the populations that's really rather understudied is our aging elders. And so Broad and colleagues in their study, they found that a lot of, it's a relatively small study, so we have to be careful, but they found, some accumulated life burden of illness with ADHD and greater impairments in productivity. And the continuity of symptoms into later adulthood is pretty well established in other studies. So we definitely need to think about ADHD and its impact, not just in children, but also in our aging adults. So what resources do y'all see in folks with ADHD? If we think of it about ADHD, not just as a problem, but also as a resource.
Sense of humor.
Creativity,
Very often.
sense of humor. Out of the box thinking, crisis management, decision making. Yeah. Okay. Pattern recognition. Aversion to planning. Yes, that is yes. Gaming skills. Yeah. So lots of different resources. And so if we're thinking about ADHD in a non-pathologizing window, we're also going to be looking at the resources in ADHD. And there's some suggestions that not only the things that y'all are finding that if people are in a environment, yeah, I'm just getting distracted. Sorry. Yeah, I multiple screens is probably bad right now. If people have a nurturing enough environment that a lot of these gifts and resources can show up. Hugman and colleagues in their 2020 study found that there was some suggestion that the divergent thinking in neurodiverse people like ADHD can be a resource, like the out-of-the-box thinking you all were talking about. One of the concerns that some people with ADHD talk about is they're worried about their creativity being impaired. Yet in this study, what they found is that stimulant medication did not impair the creativity. So some folks with ADHD will say, I don't want to go on my meds because I'm afraid the meds will hurt my creative ability, but they actually found it didn't. And then hyperfocus has been conceptualized as a major resource, that ability to kind of, once you get in the zone with a project, really stay with it. Getting in the zone can be a pain in the ass, but once you get there, it's great. More research is needed on this, though. A lot of the research still tends to be traditional medical model, pathologizing based, but I did want to at least give a shout out to some of those resources that are emerging in the literature. And then treatment. Meds seem to be first line therapy still in the research, but supportive therapy with meds has been argued to be kind of the option par excellence. Reviewing intersectionality, remember, thinking about, the Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, that multiple diverse or minority identities can create unique experiences. We want to be aware and open to how people with multiple diversity identities can have very unique experiences and listen to them. For example, people who are neurodivergent and have differences in ability, or who are trans or gender diverse, might have very different experiences, and I think that's important to attune to. Let's dive into the sex stuff. So ADHD sexuality, a literature review by Soldati and colleagues found that ADHD people had more sexual desire, frequency of masturbation, sexual dysfunctions than general population, and less sexual satisfaction. A comparison study by Gregorio Hertz and colleagues found that individuals with ADHD supported significantly more hypersexual behaviors. And and no differences in sexual dysfunction. So we see a little bit of conflict in some of the literature. There's kind of some conflicting messages. Soldati also found no connection between hypersexuality. I think sometimes that's, kind of one of the stereotypes. Tuckman, in their book ADHD After Dark, which was not peer-reviewed research and not IRB approved, so we definitely need to be cautious. But they do talk about that there was a strong desire for novelty and kind of sensation seeking. So in summary, this is there's a lot more information here, but this is a really quick snapshot of some of the research on ADHD sexuality. ADHD folks may be more sexual. There definitely seems to be some sensation seeking. Might get sexually distracted at times, like might be hyper-focused on sex at times and not focused on sex at all. But there is some conflict in the literature, so we need to be kind of cautious. And then when we move into kink, neurodivergence and kink is kink studies are kind of in their infancy, but neurodivergence and kink is it's kind of like preterm a little bit. It's still very much developing. There are some studies, and wanted to give a shout out to Tashra's International Kink Health study that's currently going on. And starting later this year, I'll be doing my dissertation on this population as well. The Kink Health study will have a nice big sample of health, and we'll have some papers coming out looking at neurodivergent versus neurotypical folks. My dissertation will be focused just on neurodivergent. There is some research looking at kink and ADHD that's been stigmatizing. For example, this case report of a child who, 16-year-old with ADHD who had a fetish for stealing women's underwear. They just really like women's underwear. I know lots of kinky fuckers who like women's underwear. Nothing wrong with that, but they were thoroughly shamed, and eventually that sexual pathology was removed. And so it's sad that sometimes still kink. I interpreted this as kink shaming. Others might disagree. Though dated, Kafka and colleagues in '98 found higher incidences of fetishes in people diagnosed with ADHD. So this might be kind of a precursor to some possible higher prevalence of people who are, have ADHD and are interested in kink. In 2016, Tashra conducted the Kink Health study, Sprott and Randall. They did have some questions about ADHD and autism. There were some limitations in the statistics we could do because the population wasn't big enough. So you have to have a large enough population for power to be able to make meaningful statistical explanations. So they did have about 4% of their population had sought treatment. That doesn't mean that that was everybody who had ADHD, but that's how that question was framed. 6% in their lifetime had treatment for it. In the International Kink Health study, we just ask if people have been diagnosed with ADHD, not if they get treatment. We're really trying to get a more broad metric. Generally, interestingly, the demographics of people, the gender identity of people who had at some point gotten treatment for ADHD in the study, more female people than anybody else, which was a little bit unusual. Again, going back to that more males tend to get diagnosed than females, and quite a good variation in different types of gender diversity. Like a lot of studies, this Bay Area study was predominantly white ethnicity. That's one of the problems in a lot of social sciences research. Most had completed some college. Most made under $60,000 a year, which in the Bay Area is starvation wages. And most had a queer sexual orientation, bisexual, lesbian, gay, pansexual, and a small number of asexual people, 2.9%. However, that is larger than the asexual estimates for the national average. It's about 3 times larger. Health experiences, 15% had a kink-related injury or medical complication, slightly higher than the overall sample. That was 13.5%. So does ADHD cause greater likelihood of injury? Maybe slightly, but again, these are low numbers, so we have to be cautious in our interpretation. 37% had discussed a kink-related concern with a medical professional. That's higher than the overall sample. 31% were out as kinky to their medical provider, and 64% were out to their therapist, which was higher than the overall sample. There was a question about which gender pursues treatment. If I had to guess, I would say it was probably more AFAB people than AMAB people, because that's the national trend. This study, because the numbers were so small, again, that was only 77 people had sought treatment at one point and 110 in their lifetime. It's too small to make a lot of extrapolations about treatment seeking. So I don't have those demographics on how that broke down about who was seeking treatment. But if you want to email me, I can ask and follow up. 48% had sex in the last 3 months while high on drugs or alcohol, so kind of a high chem sex number. And 51% had used cannabis. So this is the research. I mean, there's not much here, and that's part of why, giving a little shameless self-plug, I want to do some dissertation research on autism and ADHD and kinky folks at some point in the future. And another shameless plug that Tasha's International Kink Health Study is currently recruiting people, and the more people we get, the stronger the things we can say, right? You have to have a good sample size to get a large enough number of people who have ADHD to be able to make any kind of statements that have any kind of meaning behind them. So stay tuned for that. And if you want more information, please do let me know. We're hoping that those will add some meaningful information to this body of literature. And thank you for pasting the link. And I will put my email in the chat as well. If you wanted to email me, I will have more stuff on my study as I get it going. I'm hoping to launch in the fall. So I did want to throw in a little bit of speaking to the community, because the academic literature is kind of wanting, like we just reviewed. And so the Queer Courtesan wrote this 10 ways BDSM helps ADHD. And I thought this would be a nice transition into Eve's stuff. And they talk about a dynamic means clear expectations, power exchange circumvents executive dysfunction, play is a refuge, I've learned to be self-aware, healthy people pleasing, daddy gives me a routine, BDSM is adaptable to my brain, power exchange reins in my impulsivity, I've learned to ask for help, and I've learned self-acceptance. So why do we see this overlap? The explicit negotiated boundaries of kink may appeal to neurodivergent folks by giving clarity of expectations, which may be difficult due to considerable energy in translating from neurotypical to mainstream, especially for autistic folks. The respect for bodily autonomy inherent in negotiation may appeal to sensory sensitive folks. So that's the highly sensitive folks and autistic folks primarily, although some people with ADHD also have sensory sensitivities. The sensory experiences of hyper, you want more sensation, or hypo, you want less sensation, can be appealing to folks with both. Social skills being clearly laid out in kink classes and negotiation norms. One of the interesting things in one of the studies in autism is that there's a high overlap between kind of nerd, geek culture, we want to go take classes and read books and talk about nerdy, geeky things, and then we can vlog each other, and kink, there's like this overlap between these communities. And kink may also facilitate dopamine, which is also talked about. There might be some clear overlap, but definitely some ways that it's facilitative. And so we went 5 minutes over. That was the power hose of a real brief touching on ADHD and sexuality and some of the kink research. We will have a longer training in probably November on this. That will probably be a 2-day training if you're interested, that Tasha will be hosting. That will be able to kind of unpack some of this stuff and hopefully provide some preliminary results from the International Kink Health Study. As a heads up, in these next slides, we are going to be talking about how kink can facilitate wellness. And these will include photographs and several videos showing some really incredibly awesome kink shit. If you need to take care of yourself, please do so. If you need to turn off your screen, if you need to step away, take care of yourself, okay? All right, Eve, you're up. I think you're muted.
All right, there we go. So conscientious that I would make a sound that then I couldn't get the button to work. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to take a minute to make sure there's no questions as we transition to the next bit. I am not a clinician. I am a practitioner. I am a somatic practitioner, which means that I work hands-on with clientele. I do talk to them as well as working with them physically and psychologically in a myriad of ways. But my work is not currently codified in such a way that I cannot touch. And to me, sometimes the touch really makes the difference. So some of these photographs will actually show some touch, but there's also many ways to touch people and to do things physically in their bodies to help them sense what's going on in their body, you know, somatically, as we say, without touching them, but trussing them up in a certain way with bondage or clothing or what have you. So like Steve was talking about with the ADHD, I mean, I think a lot of those points were very, very clear. I am a person who lives with ADHD and also CPTSD, which brings in another element and aspect to that. And I think that as we continue this work, we're going to be able to dialogue and present some more ideas around when you have other factors combined. But for today's sake, we're going to mostly try to stick with, you know, the sort of purest version of ADHD that we have already laid out for you. So one of the first questions I ask is when and how do I encourage people to get out of their heads and into their bodies? With ADHD, it can be very much, oftentimes very clever, very clever, very chatty. And, you know, you could just find yourself just talking away the entire session, wherein if I did that, I think I would be doing a disservice to them, because they need to hit that that space in their bodies and feel it and to experience it and then bring it back home in order for it to be actualized, is my personal assessment on that. So, you know, noting, you would always observe when you're dealing with somebody, are they unfocused? Are they talking too much? Are they fidgety? Are they dissociating? You know, there are tips and techniques around this. It could be as simple as, hi, are you with me? You know, are we together here right now? Or, you know, talking too much, of course, people would say, oh, just gag them, just gag them. But in reality, you can talk through a gag. So I would add some DS components of, you know, all right, let's take a moment to breathe and get into our bodies. And should you start speaking out of turn, I'm going to spank you, pinch your nipples, or turn up the E stem, bringing in an element of something that may be potentially actively engaging and a turn on, shall we say, or it can also go to the level of discomfort or non-erotic, right? So being aware of your person, being, you know, even if it's the first time, this is where observation comes in. But even if you've been playing or working with someone for years and years and years, this day may be an off day. Maybe they're normally very, very talky, and then this day they come in and they're a little slumpy. Observing that, engaging it, and then determining how to go from there is going to be helpful, much more so than just doing the same old thing. So I do feel like contingency is also very important. So breath. I train all my people to breathe. It doesn't mean that they actually, that all of them learn it or lean on it as a focus. But I do find that when I, as an ADHD person myself, am practicing breath work with my clients, I find that I can find that space to breathe and be present whilst training them to breathe and be present. And the reasons for this, for both ADHD and autistic folks, is for the ADHD in particular, the breathing gives them a breath, gives them a space to sort of get that oxygen to their bloodstream, take a moment, breathing out, being present, a relaxed and open-minded space, and also an ability to then absorb the various activities that may occur, not just absorb, but process is what I want to say, process. Because if they can do that in a relaxed and engaged fashion, then they're truly hitting these various neurological aspects or drugs in the body in ways that become a lot more intentional and useful. A quick note on that, you can have a person come in as I'm a masochist, I'm a masochist, I'm a masochist. And I would say that most of your masochists tend to be in the ADHD department. But once they come in and you're like, okay, so let's try some corporal. You're doing, maybe some whipping or some caning or something, and you're noticing that they're just sort of like I'm taking it. That's not absorbing it through your body. That's not processing that extreme sensation. That's just, it's in the head. It's an ego trip. It's a psychological thing. Like, it's an identity piece. No problem with that in general. However, when you start to train the ADHD masochist, so to speak, to really breathe and be in their body fully, easily, I would say 9 times out of 10, they will, their need for extreme sensation will decrease. And I think that that's fascinating. And I think it's worth helping people understand that it's not just a game. We're not here to say like, oh, I'm the best, masochist or what have you. It's more so what's good for your body. What does your body need? Because your body then is going to influence what your brain needs and vice versa. How do I go to the next slide, Steve?
You just tell me to go and we go.
Okay. So this, speaking of ADHD masochists, this is one of my all-time favorite ADHD masochists. Super duper smart. Never a dull moment. Would start the sessions days before they would even arrive to town. They were from a different country. Had to come up with a myriad of ways of getting into their body and their mind and their soul so that they could then be relaxed and present in scene. So it would come gradually. For example, a week ahead of time, start using Tabasco on all of your food. You need to put 4 to 10 drops. Why? Because it heightens your blood. It gets your blood flowing and creates that spice, which is an internal sort of extreme sensation. And I use extreme sensation intentionally instead of using the term pain, because pain for some folks is very much about pleasure, and for others it's not erotic and not pleasurable. So it gets bandied about in ways that I don't think are as useful as saying sensation, extreme sensation, less sensation, working it that way. So yeah, and then, of course, when it's coming out, it's also burning. So it's starting that sort of masochistic endeavor from the interior out. And then I would also instruct them to start taking aspirin because masochists oftentimes get calluses on their bums, and then it's really hard for them to feel past the callus. It feels like a deck of cards on their bums. Now, what does this have to do with ADHD? It has everything to do with it. So because the ADHD person is constantly thinking like 5, 10, 12 steps up, around, in and out. And if you, as the somatic practitioner with them, can meet them there and then hold space for them in all of those places, maybe even take them somewhere they've never been, 2 or 3 places at the same time. Oddly enough, overstimulation is relaxing for the ADHD. So, I mean, I can't tell you, he looks so peaceful here. This is not a peaceful person. And, you know, and I've got all the action going. So I like this shot quite a bit. We can look at the next one. Are there any questions? Right. So as Steve had already mentioned, with ADHD, there are a number of approaches, and you used a lot about role playing and fantasy and stuff, which I'm going to get into here. That's much more common, I find, with the ADHD than with autistic. So for me, I do the diagnostic. We meet, I'm observing, I teach them the breath, I do all the things. The diagnostic is also, how much are you really available and turned on by submission or dominance? Now, generally when I work as the dominant, but you know, I can suss out and encourage and work with dominants with other submissives to coach them. So it does, I am full spectrum there. The negotiation, you know, how observant are they? How direct are they? Once again, are they being restless, etc. Then directives, like, you know, if I say to you, take your hat off and put it to the left of the front door, and you take your hat off and throw it, you know, on the floor, you're already missing a simple direction. I'm not going to call you out like as a judge or as a, you know, naughty person unless I know your ego can take that and we're trying to work that ego, which with, I find, ADHD folks, it can be a great way to play, to sort of bring, once again, they'll have a lot of ideas about themselves. So kind of bringing those ideas down one at a time and examining them can be very useful. All right, so as far as restraint goes, they're not always into bondage. They don't need it necessarily. However, if you are going to sort of give them lots of different layering and different sensations and ways of release, some form of restraint will be your friend. When we get to autism, I will say that so much more what I would call bondage instead of restraint is useful. This goes back to what you were saying, Steve, the trussing up, the fetish, the desire to please, the play, the role play, the fantasy, really, really activates on so many different levels and allows them to just fly. And when I say fly, I mean, or does anybody have any thoughts on when I say fly, what do I mean? What is flying in a scene?
Subspace, freedom.
Subspace, freedom. Subspace is definitely flying, but you can fly without being in subspace. Meaning if I'm just service topping, I'm just like taking care of you, giving you the good flogging, whipping that you need with a little bit of paddling and maybe some, holding or light restraint or what have you. And that's what we've agreed upon, but we're not really going into a whole DS dynamic. I'm certainly providing you with a safe space for you to just have all these endorphins and dopamines and maybe even a little cortisol thrown in there to go through your body. And I'm containing that for you so that you can fly. So you're flying because you're high on your body's drugs. Make sense?
Eve, would flying be kind of like a state of flow?
Yes, very much so.
Okay.
Although with flow, I would say, in a classic DS or SM context, the flow is going to go into the dominant or the top,
Mhm.
so that the bottom or the submissive can fly.
Mhm.
So they're both flying and flowing, but the flyer is still the container, the person who's containing, the master, the dominant, so that the sub can truly fly and not have to worry about containment, safety, last night's dinner, tomorrow's big talk, whatever the case may be. They can simply fly. Does that help?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. So trussing up there, corporal, once again, we kind of covered this. So, you're doing these activities that will lead to a variety of different drugs in your body. It's also one of my best taglines, my favorite taglines ever is, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So the spanking, if you are a spankee and you really enjoy that, it is automatically going to bring plenty of endorphins, dopamines, just pleasure drugs into your body, and you're going to be really happy. Some people can orgasm from spanking alone. However, if I add an element, a DS element to it, where it's like, oh, you've been in Auntie's panty drawer again, haven't you? And I know that you're growing up. However, this is not okay. We need to, and as chastisement, now this is play chastisement. Well, that throws in a little bit of cortisol, like, oh, damn, I did the wrong thing. And then a little bit of adrenaline. And so, knowing if your person needs a little bit more of that fear factor, fear in the realm of BDSM for me means false expectations appearing real. So I'm not necessarily, sticking a knife on your throat. I may show you a knife, then blindfold you, and then use a completely different tool that's feels like a knife on your throat. You'll make the connection yourself through your false experiences appearing real. And playing with fear can be a fabulous thing, but not for everybody. So once again, knowing your person. I do think a lot of ADHD people appreciate the cortisol and the adrenaline more than our autistic friends. Tease and denial, reward, fantasy punishment, masturbation games, directives, etc. These are all things I can talk to you ad infinitum, as it were. But we do want to get on with this fabulous presentation. So I'm probably gonna just skip this page for now. Great. So here's an example of, and I'm very curious to hear what questions or what comes up for y'all in these images. Do you have clients that you think, oh, that might be a really interesting treatment for them or helpful? Or do you look at them and you know, are you looking at them and saying like, I'm still not getting this? How are you making this connection? Or, I mean, I don't know, totally get it. Don't need to say anything else. I'll hang up the phone. Very much would love to hear your thoughts. In this particular instance, if I can spell this out, is an ADHD hyper-intellectual who really found that piercing was one of her ways of going down. And so basically we have a few things happening. There's some sensory deprivation, meaning there's a hood, it's zipped up. This is a great hood because if they get claustrophobic or if they get a little, you know, too much cortisol, open the zipper just like that, pop the hood off. It's a quick release kind of situation. Same thing here with the nipples. These are suction cup nipples, so they're you know, like in acupuncture in Eastern Chinese medicine. They're pumping little pumps on the nipples, and that will then increase the sensitivity of those nipples. These are also e-stim available from the rubber grip around there, but we don't have e-stim attached at this moment. And then the needles, I mean, some people have found, you know, former drug addicts, for example, who don't partake anymore, but that rush of the needle coming through their skin gives them the sensations in the body around the similar things, the dopamines, the endorphins. Of course, it's without the drug, but it's actually kind of stunning. I mean, a lot of people who are also in recovery of any way, shape, or form, but let's just say alcohol as being one of the primary ones, they will oftentimes generate to those activities like piercing, wherein it does give you a very deep and intense hit on the endorphins and dopamine, and also I would say oxytocin, because you definitely have that person that you're doing it with, generally speaking, if you're having multiple piercings going on, and it becomes then a connection. So yeah, next one. I think, you know, similarly, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What we've got going on here is e-stim, bondage, sensory deprivation with some light breath play. The e-stim is on the nipples. So, and in a rubber suit too. So there's some fetish thrown in. Are there any questions that we should be aware of there?
Somebody asked, is that a TENS unit, the e-stim?
Yes, that is it's not your over-the-counter physical therapist's e-stim. It's actually a model that they don't make anymore. Unfortunately, it was a very good beginner model made by Folsom. And they stopped making those, I think, during the pandemic. What are they breathing into? Is that rubber? Yes, that's a rubber hood made by a place called Studio Gum out of Vienna. This hood is very interesting because it can zip off the whole front, and they're still wearing a hood underneath it where their eyes are open and their mouth is open, and they have 2 nose holes. And what you can do with that hood is you can attach a variety of different gags into the mouthpiece, inflatable gags, balls, and they have little buttons. Same thing for the eyes, you can attach a blindfold. Or in this instance, I zipped on the outer component, which is very much about breath play. Like they're breathing into a rebreather bag. I could remove that. I could put a smell that may remind them of something, or repulse them or attract them. These kinds of hoods are mostly used to play with breath play. Just put your hand over it for, a minute or so and tell them gently, nowhere to go, nothing to do, nothing to see, just relax, just relax. You could, in fact, use an intoxicant with that as well, like amyl nitrate or poppers. You could also, use a body smell, an underarm or a shoe or a pair of panties, something along those lines. Once again, knowing where their mind needs to go is what's going to determine what's the best approach to that.
There was a question about, do you find these types of high stimulation to be equally effective with both ADHD and autistic people?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I was going to address that a lot more during the autistic part. My short answer is no. My observations over time is, by and large, if you are, fairly in the ADHD camp or fairly, deep in the autism camp, there will be some crossover in here. But if you're kind of, I don't like to think of things in just one line, it's not binary. But really, if you are kind of like tightly knit in one or the other, there will be crossover, but generally speaking, and it also depends on what you consider overstimulation, because understimulation can be overstimulation, which is great for an autistic person. If you understim an ADHD person, you're going to get a bored, distractible, not able to process the material that's coming in. So you can bring them to overstimulation in order to get them to the same place you're taking your autistic person, but it will look and feel very different, if that makes sense. And again, we can talk more about that when we get there.
It looked like there was a question about clarifying what subspace is.
Well, it's one of these terms that gets bandied about, and then, everybody thinks they know what it means. I personally am, I have a literature background and I care about words quite a bit. So if it's subspace, to me, it means you are a submissive, meaning you are service-oriented, psychologically, emotionally driven, and you wish to please, you're dominant. Therefore, if your dominant is giving you a training session or a tune-up or whatever you want to call it, and you start flying, you're going to fly as a submissive might, which is to lose all capabilities of being completely on top of your head, like, oh, are they doing okay? Do I need to do something? Like you're flying in your own. However, you have to let go of that service-driven part to get there. And that's what makes it submissive. Like you're surrendering your deep need to take care of, to control, even to some extent, but mostly to please. You're allowing yourself to fly. And that to me is the distinction between subspace and just flying, because if you're a bottom who's getting all the activity on your body and you have all these body drugs that are happening and they're opening you up and you're like, woo, I'm flying, you probably won't have that intrusion in your head. And I think this is another reason why I would argue that um, DS folks tend to be much more ADHD folks, or at least somewhere in that spectrum, because they don't necessarily want to just have, and ego, narcissism, and all that aside, they don't want to just have their pleasure. They want, they're people pleasers. They want other people, especially their dominant or whoever is dominating them in that moment, to also enjoy themselves. Whereas a bottom is not as necessarily concerned with that. They want the sensation, they want to get off, they want their endorphins, and it's happy making for everyone because there's less pressure around that. Even if you are a pretty intense sort of DS person or need to go into subspace or what have you, I always encourage people who get into intense spaces pretty quickly to just practice doing more service topping and service bottoming to kind of get your feet wet, like start to feel what it's like to not have all that pressure, so that you can find different aspects of enjoyment instead of it being always so intense. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I know there's a lot of questions. I'm also kind of aware of where we're at with time. And so unfortunately, we probably won't have a chance to catch all of the questions, but do email us if there's something you wanted out of this that we didn't get to.
Don't email me.
Yeah, email me.
Text me. I'll put my phone number in the chat. I may not see your email for ages. I'm terrible with it. So we can move to the next one then, right, Steve?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we need to go over this one. This is clearly a great case of multiple layers, ADHD, out the wazoo, nowhere to go, nothing to do, let me take care of you, and enjoy your rubber fetish while we're at it. So it's all neuro. We kind of covered some of this. There are ways of making sure that they are present with you. Using acronyms is one of my preferred ways. SLAR with my submissives, which stands for stop, listen, ask, repeat. Because they oftentimes tend to be ADHD, they'll be like, oh yes, yeah, I'll go do that, and then you go to check it out later and they've not done it because they weren't listening. So if I get a sense that they may not be listening, I'll say SLAR, and then they know stop, listen, ask, repeat. Or in this case, I put Pam, pay attention to me. You can create your own. There doesn't have to be a dictionary for this necessarily. There are a lot of terms that are important, but I don't think it has to be written in stone. Environment, absolutely. And we'll get more to environment when we discuss, especially our autistics. Yeah. Are there any more images? I think.
Yep.
Yeah, so here we have a little piggy on the floor doing some DS work, all kinds of potential healing going on there. Even talking about, this is a race play scene in a sense, but for her empowerment. We can go to the next one. Similar, this is a person who, one of the extreme masochist types who really needs to be bound and very busy, lots of activity going on at all times. And next one, similar with fetishes. I find the fetishes are more lighthearted with the ADHD folk. I think the doubly gifted is where, I think this client actually is more doubly gifted. They're more fetishistic, bound, layer, I mean, all the things. They have to have a lot of stuff going on, but at the same time, it's really like must be the corset, the fur, the, you know, it's like a very particular, which is a little bit more um, autistic. So any more?
Yeah, we got a couple more.
Okay. Oh, I think somebody kind of brought that up earlier. Can understand work for ADHD. I think we can talk about that more when we get into the autistic aspects, but absolutely, you know, that's what I was saying earlier. Like you can go in with the same way, but you just have to do it in a different fashion.
Okay.
And I just wanted to mention that, you know, aftercare depends on needs. I find ADHD folks and autistic folks to have different ways of needing aftercare. I would say, generally speaking, the ADHD is like, okay, I'm all good, you know. Oh, I'll take a shower. You know, it's like, oh, okay, that's really quick. You know, when I'm like, there's some, you know, variations within that, but that's just sort of a general observation. Whereas the autistic will need to be really brought back. And that's through closure. And we can talk about that more if we have time later.
One of the things I like that you're mentioning here is kind of that collaboration. And just like Eve and I are modeling, we're big fans of collaboration between licensed therapists and somatic professionals. And that's a big part of not only what we're trying to model, but what we're trying to advocate for. Because this would be a great, like you point out here, a great thing for like, okay, you had some insights. Now go talk about that in therapy, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I send my clients to therapists all the time. Oh, I guess there's one more slide. That's just sweet. Very, very ADHD rubber fetishist. Let's just leave it at that. Oh, there's that quote. Maybe we'll just give them that. We don't have enough time to read it and think about it. But basically it's about, you know, that sort of socialized state, you know, bringing, for me, it's almost always like nurturing, no matter what the I'm doing or I'm showing. It's always about nurturing them out back to a primal or a pre-socialized state, so they can just be, they can be embryonic, they can be wild, they can be sexy, and give them that space. Yeah, is there another one we can just buzz
Yeah, there's
through?
a movie. Should I just go ahead and play it?
Yeah, just play it while I'm talking. And this is just a little, GIF, but that's definitely an example of over and under stimulation simultaneously. Is that it?
Yep. Let me see. Yes.
Here we go.
All right. Anything else on that before we keep going? Any questions for Eve on ADHD? Okay. So let's talk about autism. Again, we're moving away from some language, and there's different ways. You know, some people still prefer like on the spectrum or a person with ADHD, but we're using that identity first. So autistic person. And again, kind of some different comical ways of making fun of some of the language. Person who suffers from autism, or somebody who's standing on the spectrum, person with autism. This is kind of why some of that language is shifting. Remembering that autism can look very different for different folks. In terms of history, I'm not going to read all this, but just kind of I always like to recall that, you know, we used to have autism and Asperger's diagnoses, and there was a narrative for a long time that Hans Asperger was this pretty upstanding fella, and there's some pretty strong indications in the literature that he was actually not a very upstanding person, and that was part of what led to the idea of Asperger's being removed as a name and his namesake from our diagnostic system. And now that there's just autism with 3 different levels of support needed. And so I wanted to give a shout out to that. If you're interested in that, you can take a look at the literature. The diagnostic criteria are a little bit different from the American system of the DSM-5, from the international system. You know, some differences in terms of a little bit more constrictive in the international system. Some also contend that autism is when we're talking about autism, it's not just one disorder, but we're talking about a clustering or categorizing. Just like with ADHD, we know there's 3 types of ADHD in our American diagnostic system, but there's different flavors within each of those types. There's suggestions for the same for autism. There is some indication of a higher co-occurrence of autism and gender diversity. Warrior and colleagues in 2020 investigated the reported high co-occurrence of autism and gender diversity by examining 5 independently recruited cross-sectional data sets, so pretty high sample, and compared to cisgender individuals, so people who their assigned sex at birth matches their gender identity. The authors found that gender diverse individuals have on average higher rates of autism. Other studies, autistic children conform less to gender role expectations than peers. There's less sex differences in brain structure for autistic folks compared to allistic or non-autistic or neurotypical, however you want to phrase that. Prevalence is US frequency is usually around 1 to 2%, non-US frequency is around 1%. So much lower than ADHD. In my own clinical practice, I see a lot of AFAB and gender diverse people who never got diagnosed in childhood and didn't have the privilege of supports in childhood. So I wonder how much our diagnostic criteria are still very based upon AMAB people. The system where we started with autism in the early 20th century was looking at people with childhood psychosis and impatience, kind of needs, and that has influenced our diagnostic system since then. So male to female ratios are 3 to 1, according to the APA, 4 to 1 according to the WHO. But again, in my experience, I see a lot of gender diverse and AFAB people who clearly meet the diagnostic criteria, but just were missed because of stereotypes about autism as something that you more commonly see in little boys than little girls. I also think that a lot of AFAB people, because of patriarchal socialization norms, tend to have some forced masking that kicks in a lot earlier. Heritability is really rather high as well, 37 to 90%. A more recent 5-country cohort estimated heritability 80%. So again, both autism and ADHD both seem to be pretty heritable. Polygenetic, it just means that there's more than one gene. It's fairly complicated. And again, contrary to the fraudulent science of Wakefield, there's no connection with vaccines and autism's etiology. There's no one cause of autism. It does seem to be highly genetic, and that multiple genes are involved, and some of those genes are the same genes involved in ADHD. That's why we kind of think of these as sibling diagnoses. There do tend to be some environmental contributions, but that's really not well understood at this point. There's some argument that there could be an overgrowth in the frontal cortex during the early postnatal period, and that the pruning that happens from that overgrowth, from the connections between the brain cells, the neurons, that doesn't happen. That's one of the major theories of what autism is. Okay. There's lots of overlap between autism and high intelligence, as well as ADHD and high intelligence. And so there's some argument that the genes that turn on autism can also turn on for high intelligence. That's good. Some argue, like Crespi in 2016, and this is kind of part of that whole idea of neuroemergence versus neurodivergence, that maybe these are evolutionary adaptations. Crespi characterized autism as a dysregulation of intelligence. That it's kind of intelligence going out of control, and others can view it differently. I'm just going to kind of skip over this again, kind of for time, because I want to make sure that you gets a good amount of time to go over some of the wonderful content at the end. There can be resources in autism. Again, not every ADHD or not every autistic has resources, but there can be resources. We're wanting to look at not just the struggles and not just the pathologizing lens, but also recognize the resources that some people have. Some autistic people learn to read at a really young age. My nieces are all very autistic, and they all learn to read much earlier than you're supposed to be able to read. 9 months, 10 months, or some word recognition, 1 year, 2 years reading books. It's kind of weird to see a toddler reading a book, but it does happen. Memorizing and learning information quickly, thinking and learning in a visual way, logical thinking, a lot of STEM academic excellence, good memory, precision and detail orientation, honesty and reliability, dependability due to reliance on routines and schedule, kind of some alternative problem solving. And all of this is kind of connected with the connection between autism and high IQ. Not every autistic person has a high IQ. Not every autistic person has these gifts, but some do, a lot do. There's not really a gold standard treatment, but there is some concern with ABA, applied behavioral analysis. Prior ABA was considered kind of the gold standard, but there were some methodological challenges in the research studies that argued for ABA, short-term follow-up, small sample sizes. Others contend that ABA can be very abusive. In my own experience, it's really how the thing is done. But if ABA is saying this person's wrong for stimming and you have to teach them not to do that thing, that could be abusive. I actually do a lot of prescribed stimming. Not only am I stimming myself in session, rocking and wiggling and moving and bouncing around and doing all the things, but a lot of people, it's an incredible resource. And I've a lot of people will that I've had the privilege of working with have found that giving themselves permission to do that sensory stimming can be incredibly powerful. There are 2 medications approved by the FDA for treatment, risperidone and aripiprazole. However, there's some concern about low evidence and side effects with these meds. A lot of my first line recommendations are to reduce shame, encourage self-soothing, prescribe stimming, and just learning how to translate between areas. I think the shame and the stimming barriers are the 2 biggest ones, although I see a lot of adults who are autistic who didn't have the privilege of a diagnosis in childhood. Autism and sexuality. And so despite some early misinformation, autistic people are very sexual. Autistic women in the Sala and colleagues study in 2020 appear to have heightened risk of unwanted sexual experiences than autistic males do. So there's some risk of kind of being taken advantage of. And that's one of the things that, I've been doing some kind of community workshopping as I'm thinking about my dissertation and wanting to kind of get some ideas from the people, from different folks. And one of the things that a lot of community members have talked about is that a lot of kinky autistic AFAB folks can enter kink and feel like, okay, cool, like this is the type of sexuality where maybe I can be safe. And there are some people in our kink communities that are wonderful, consensual, lovely fuckers, and there's some sharks, and the sharks sometimes take advantage of those folks. And I think that's what Sala and colleagues are finding in their study. Turner and colleagues note that autistic individuals, especially AFAB folks, show a higher diversity in sexual orientation, and greater frequency of relationship and sexual experiences than neurotypical controls, a higher frequency of non-heterosexual folks. So we got lots of our lovely LGBTQ queers. A lot of studies of autistic sexuality utilizes a sex negative or pathologizing perspective, which is one of the challenges in some of the literature. Other studies on CO and colleagues last year, they found some, they explored the co-occurrence of autism and asexuality in some folks, and they found that asexuality and autism share some aspects. Again, this is not all autistics, but some autistics do identify. There can be some role of prenatal factors. There could be references to romantic dimensions of sexual attraction, sexual orientation, non-partner orientation, and many self-identified asexuals have a formal diagnosis. However, more evidence is needed because this study was unfortunately a smaller sample size. Rosequift and Jackson Perry in 2020 argue that autistic experiences of sexuality challenge existing assumptions about good and healthy sexuality within couplehood. And I really agree with that, that we have a lot to learn from our neurodivergent brothers and sisters and community members. Some folks who are asexual will have interest in things like kink more than a partner's gender. Some autistic folks I've had the privilege of working with would identify as a kink sexual, for example. Let's keep going. Again, limited research. There's more research that I've been able to run into on autism and kink versus ADHD and kink, ironically enough. Several researchers and numerous community members have noticed an increased frequency of sexual differences from mainstream culture, such as kink in autistic communities. And again, this is not one study, this is like a body of studies. So it does seem like among autistic folks, sometimes that sexuality doesn't fit into mainstream norms. A recent article by a friend of mine, Ariel Pliskin, talks about how, really good article just came out. He was trying to illustrate how neurodivergence plus societal reactions may lead to increase in kink engagement. He talks about how the kink community can be well suited for some autistic folks because consent communication norms serve autistic needs for explicit and literal language. BDSM activity may be a form of stemming for autistic people based on the literature reviewed. And I think for some people, it can be. Normalized learning, frame of communication skills in kink may be helpful, and kink may often become an autistic person's special interest. I've definitely seen that happen before. Kink may help autistic people navigate and organize their intense, chaotic, and unpredictable experiences in the world. I know as an ADHD person myself, I can definitely relate to Ariel's work here. And I think I've seen kink myself, because I'm also a kinky fucker, to be something of a STEM at times. Tashra's 2016 kink health study, the numbers were too low for the autistic population to actually do any kind of statistical analysis, but we're hoping the international kink health study will have higher numbers. And there are some studies. There's one study that was just got a pre-publication online release. We're going to go over in a slide, and one study that's currently in process. So some research starting to be developing, but much larger queer population of autistic people in their sample, and a larger overall gender diverse than cisgender, and predominantly white. Bauscher, in their undergraduate thesis research, conducted a study looking at the relationship between BDSM behaviors and autism. And they found a self-reported autism. So there's challenges in self-report, of course, but that was 5 times the national average for autism. It was almost 6% of their sample identified as being autistic. And again, it's about 1% of the population across the world. They contend that the similarities in ritualistic behavior and sensory stimulation needs in autism and the kink community can kind of explain some of those similarities between the two populations. They found support for the hypotheses that motor movements positively correlate with BDSM sensory behavior, and attention to detail would positively correlate with BDSM control behavior. This backs up contentions by other studies of general autistic sexuality that find a portion of the population seem to use kink to meet their sensory and ritualized needs. Some limitations: there's a need for replication. If 5% of a sample of 500 people, that's not a very large sample. And so these are some of their ramifications from this, or I guess closer to 6%, but 6% of 500 is not huge. That's not great for statistical analysis. It says one of the weakness, and there's some challenges with self-report versus diagnosis. One of the other limitations is most of the autistic people in Boucher's study identified as bottoms or submissives or slaves. They tended to take the follower role rather than the leader role. And the experience of autistic dominance or switches or masters or mistresses or whatever terminology folks want to use for those leaders might be very different. Pearson and Hodgetts just released their study. That's why it's 2022/2023, because when it actually goes in press and paper, it'll be 2023 will be their publication date, but they just released that they did an interpretative phenomenological analysis. So these are in-depth interviews of 6 autistic kinky adults in order to explore how engagement with kink related to autistic identity. And 3 key themes is practicing safe sex highlighted how the clear communication and explicit focus on consent present in BDSM/kink facilitated a feeling of safety. And that's what we were talking about earlier, that some people will really be drawn in who are autistic folks to kink because they'll say, okay, cool, like the rules and the structures and all of this stuff helps me feel safe. And that can also mean that they can be at risk for the sharks in the community. I think a lot of my own personal bias is if you're in the community, if you're going to the munches, if you're going to the classes, if you're going to the trainings, if you're doing the mentoring, that is far safer kink than if you're doing it just off of Fed. My own personal bias. I think the community self-corrects a little bit. Another theme, so many ways to be touched or touch, was focused on the sensory draw to BDSM and kink and how it provided exciting ways to explore sensory joy and sometimes revulsion. Something it's interesting that our yuck and our yum can sometimes be very close and rub against each other and even cross into each other. And then finally, subverting neuronormativity showed how autistic people can find pleasure in intimate practices which transgress normative expectations. A really great study that just got released. One of the other interesting overlaps is kink and furries. The research teams that I get to volunteer with and be a part of, it's really interesting because we just started reaching out to the furry community and they are even more, we have to be vetted. We're still kind of getting vetted because of harms. So they really want to make sure that we're going to be safe. But there seems to be a really high overlap, especially of autistic people in the furry communities. But just for y'all, there was a furry conference in Chicago recently, and I think they bought out like the 10 largest or 7 largest hotels in downtown Chicago or something like that. Like just huge conferences. These are not small communities. In July of last year, a popular press article by Hodge interviewed Elizabeth Fine, who has studied furries in the furry fandom for the past 15 years. And she explained that it's become a safe haven for many people on who are autistic, who she estimates, kind of informally are 5 to 15% of furries, much higher than the 1 to 2% of the general population. She talks about how the suits are very comforting for many people on the spectrum who feel less pressure to do subtle nonverbal facial and body language when in a suit. So in furry costumes, your face is obscured, kind of like some of the masks and different things, can block out overwhelming sensory inputs. And she's excited by it. Another study by Ryson and colleagues studied self-reported diagnoses and found there's a higher incidence of anime fans, bronies, and furries who reported a prior diagnosis of autism compared to the general population. So in their sample, 807 people identified in one of those 3 special interest groups. Rates of being a furry and having ADHD were not different from the general population, but what they found is the rates of autism and furry were higher. Some of the limitations, these were eyeball comparisons where you don't have 2 comparison groups. The ADHD people and non-ADHD people and compare them within the same study. They're doing what's called an eyeball comparison, where you look at studies of general population and you look at your study. And there's some methodological problems and limitations in doing it that way. But it does give us kind of an informal metric. Some community resources, if you're interested in reading more about, and these tend to be more focused on autism and kink, but in their book, Broken Toys, Toshlin and Caldera talk about slaves and submissives they've had who have been autistic. I think Caldera self-identifies as autistic, and Mastering Mind, they also talk about, being a dominant and being autistic. So before we roll on, were there any questions? I know I moved through that pretty quickly. I wasn't able to keep up with the chat. Questions or concerns about kind of clinical information on autism and kink? Okay. Let's talk about how kink can facilitate wellness.
Okay. Thanks for that, Steve. It was
Happy to info dump.
well, I was also making comments in the chat area too, because I mean, if you actually sat me down and I can talk to you about religious cultures, age, geography, like how it affects people's kink and sexuality and identity, because a lot of this is also about identity. Having said that, we're going to talk about autism now. I find with autistic folks that negotiations are more important, to sort of have a lengthy or thorough one. They may be less formal, meaning, you're not a slave on your knees, let's negotiate. You're a human being saying like, hey, I really need extreme bondage. And, oftentimes there's a fetish associated, not always, but often. I started wrapping myself in raincoats when I was 11 years old, and then getting aroused and, needing to ejaculate that way. And now this is, very much part of my reality. So that's somebody who's coming to you with a very clear, having said that, one of the main differences I find between like sort of the ADHD is they're like the explorers, okay, whatever, and also the people pleasers, whatever you want, let's do it, it's fun, it's interesting, let's try it. Even if it comes in with that approach, it's still going to be very healing and very healthy for their, sexual psyches and even their just general movements in life. However, with the autistic types, they tend to really be like, this is what I want, this is what I need, and this is how I like to have it. And if they're ever so, gently kind, or maybe have a little smidge of ADHD in there or something like, but, I don't want to tell you what to do. And, I'm very much of the mindset of, tell me what to do. I am just as happy as a service top as I am as a creator. And no matter how much time or energy that we spend talking about this stuff, when you start combining people's energies together, things will come up. So once again, it's not what you do, but how you do it. How do you manage misunderstanding? How do you manage troubleshooting in the scene without stopping it? Or do you stop it? You know, how do you know when that's the best option? So I would say that the negotiations are less formal because they're a lot more directive. I feel as though there are a lot more engineers, tech folk, like people with sort of mechanical minds in this realm. Very collaborative, possibly very directive, but not like as much about I want to please you, or you know, whatever you want, etc., etc. A lot more gadgets. And when I say gadgets, I say it with all due respect. I am one of those people. So I did mention earlier that I am ADHD. My sister was autistic. And I sometimes wonder if I am not partially autistic myself, because there are aspects to autism that I completely relate to. And that like formality of sort of having when I say gadget, it doesn't have to be a fancy gadget. It could be the microphone with which I am speaking. Look at it, isn't it cute? Come on, give me a smile, everybody. You don't see my microphone? Where am I? You see it? Somebody's looking like I can't see it. Anyway,
I see some hearts.
It was a joke. That was for a little levity. But basically, it could be a blanket. It could be a hat. It doesn't have to be a $12,000 piece. However, particularly with the more mechanically engineered autistic types who have certain fixations and or needs to have an erotic experience in a particular way, that's who I'm addressing in that moment. And then my final note on that is they may have social challenges, but with a professional can be more exacting, blunt, without worrying about being rejected. What I'm trying to say there is, some of these clients lead fairly lonely lives. And I think it comes about, in a few different ways societally. We talked about this earlier when, socially, if you're supposed neurotypical family, or at least they think they want to be, and they want to superimpose all their socialization onto you, and you're not fitting in, and then you go off to primarily a AMAB profession, but you're open to women, but you can't find one, and then you can't talk to them anymore. It just becomes like this cycle. And then how the hell are you going to actually tell them, well, gee, I want to be, wrapped up in 3 raincoats and, have you sit on my chest with a vibrator on my genitals? I think as professionals here today, I would like to think that all of us are like, well, that seems okay. Why not? Right? However, the reality is not so much. And I very, very much encourage all of my clients, no matter what level, because I don't necessarily believe that, masturbating with your left hand wearing a satin glove whilst, having a vibrator in your bum and getting caned is any worse or any better of a way to ejaculate than, pushing it into your partner. I don't personally actually understand why we do that. Society, I mean. Side note. All right, so seeing a professional really can help them to validate, to have a safe space, and to also learn how to find those partners who will be okay with that. Next one, Steve. Right, so that's my mummy bunny. He actually came to me in his early 40s. I saw him for 15, 20 years in Chicago before I moved out here. He was a virgin. And that was his way of getting release. I never touched him physically with skin on skin. I would mummify him and use vibration on the genitals on the various levels of mummification. And he would do overnights and everything. Very, very committed to that sensory deprivation, that very contained space. Yeah, he eventually met a partner and did finally have a human penile vaginal penetration. And then that was difficult for him for a while because he didn't want to tell her, et cetera, et cetera. So, these are the things that we, can help people. Like on one hand, you can help validate or offer safe space and or actually encourage finding of partners who are pleased and amenable and encouraging of alternative sexualities. I don't even like to use that because I like to think that anyway. Next one, Steve. Yeah, so here's another one. This is very much a bondage person, very much a solid, autistic, mechanical engineered type. Didn't really care what happened beyond this point because he needed to be in that, the rubber suit with the multiple layers, the extreme head bondage, no movement. So I didn't have to get in his head and do this, do that. It's like once we were there in that moment, that was sufficient. And I think that lends itself to, some discussion around how the autistic types, they may need more sensory deprivation and or bondage, things that really encapsulate or encase, or very subtle, like a little sound in their ear, just gently like an ASMR. But they don't need on your knees or, now you're going to do this. I would say that for all bondage fetishists and or aficionados across the board, simply stating, you're mine now. I can do with you what I will. You have nothing to worry about. There's nowhere to go, nothing to do. Sort of back to that idea. That's always a winner. And I think that's fairly across the board for anyone. And I think it also makes sense because neurodiversity aside, we live in a society where we're constantly worried about other people and what they're thinking and how they're feeling and our jobs and our expectations of our jobs and how we represent. And in this state, this person just gets a reminder of, you don't have to worry about any of that right now. So yeah, next one. Yeah, I think that's just another great example there of where the fetish and the bondage and the sensory deprivation is just happy making. So what was interesting to me was during the pandemic, I started doing some research on, I was actually trying to look at more research on swaddling. I've been doing a lot of swaddling encasement and swinging play in my new play space, and very attracted to it for a number of different reasons. personally and privately and professionally. And I'm doing this research, and it turns out, even though my sister was, diagnosed with autism, and I was diagnosed with ADHD, nothing was ever done in our lifetimes around that. And she died, unfortunately, an early death in her 40s. So I didn't know that in all this time, I'm doing this research for a very specific, like, kink thing. All this stuff has come out for autistic children and adults. They have veritable playgrounds of tense and visual, deprivation and rubbing and the, you guys, I'm sure you know the language much better than me, but it was so fascinating because I'm like, oh, this is the shit I've been doing for years and years and years with these people. And I got so excited that, even though it's a different type of clientele in the sense of we're talking about adults versus children and various other aspects, the techniques are still quite similar. So this is just a list of some of those that I found, but also that I've been practicing and that I'm continuing to practice. So swaddling, and with age play, which is amazing, or at least like a rebirthing process. And the quote from Bart that we missed earlier really digs into that. Encasement, swinging, humming. I know Steve keeps saying stimming, and I didn't put stimming in as a word, but I think what I'm talking about here is like various forms of stimming. Next slide. Right. So we got a lot of bondage, encasement, and vibration. Next one. Oh, so this is just a little moment with the encasement swinging. Yeah, we can go to the next one. I think there's another one. And with that, with the lights and the music, and I have other things that I bring in now. I even have an like a blindfold. And interestingly enough, I actually got this for myself because I have an eye situation. I have a dry eye, chronic dry eye or something with molecular generation or whatever it's called. But I bought this thing because it massages your eye and it heats it, and there's some compression and there's some vibration. And I'm like, oh my God, this thing is amazing. It made me so happy, I couldn't believe it. So I started using it with my clients. And they're like, oh my God, this is fantastic. So, back to that STEM idea. I never thought I would be a person who wanted an electrical vibrating heat compression eyepiece. But not only do I want it and need it for myself, it is definitely serving a larger purpose with my clients. So, focus on literal containment with localized stimulation. That's definitely a difference between, it doesn't mean that you can't do that with ADHD folks, but you can't do it I would say it won't be as effective if you do it for an extended period of time. Whereas with, when you saw my mummy bunny in there earlier, I'd have him wrapped up for anywhere between 3 and 12 hours. So very, very subtle, but very contained. Less concern about breathing. Right. So for the autistic folks, I find that they already have a certain amount of attunement with their body and their breath. You can maybe fine tune it or share a little bit more. But whatever, like if you really are fully mummified and you only have 2 nose holes here, how are you going to breathe? Through your 2 nose holes. So they're already kind of game for that very, very focused way of breathing. In general, complete mummification with concentration on forced, yeah, that's in general. Okay, next slide. So yeah, this is a client who I think is doubly gifted. I think that he has ADHD and autism. I know that he has an ailment that I can't remember the name of right now, but it is neurological and it's autoimmune, and it definitely has affected him for his entire life. So some of this is about how he was bullied as a child. So some of it's like social conditioning. Some of it's about him like releasing some of that trauma. Some of it's about the fetish of where he was at when he first. Some of it's about his reading. He's a very, very, very smart, very highly intellectual person. But then because his brain goes so much, he does need a lot going on, but in a quieter, gentler way, more like the autistic. So, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but I would say doubly gifted. And you have more? Yeah, so there's the swaddle. Next. So this is showing how you can use the swaddle with an ADHD person or possibly an autistic. So I'm underneath the swaddle. If you want to hit that again, Steve, thank you. So I'm underneath the swaddle and I'm just gently, placing my legs around their body. That offers more containment, more restraint, more comfort, if you will. But there's also the possibility of, are we dealing with a foot fetishist here who now knows my feet are so close to their face and may have some pleasure and relaxation around that, but also desire. They're also getting rocked physically by me. There's music playing there too. I don't know why it doesn't come up, but yeah, I mean, that's a scene where I feel like, you could be dealing with either or both, ADHD, autism, or both. And next one, or that might be it. That's it.
Yeah. So we do have a couple of minutes left. If anybody wanted to have any thoughts on kind of this work, I'm going to go ahead and move as we're doing discussion to our contact information. But questions, comments, concerns here in the last few minutes? All right, well, thank you very much for the privilege of presenting to y'all and Essie for the invitation. There was a link for CE stuff in the chat to do the survey, and would appreciate y'all's feedback there. And Eve did put her phone number there in the chat as well, if y'all are interested in contacting.
Thank you both so much. This was so jam-packed. I will follow up with everyone who registered with an email, with the survey, with the slides, with the contact information, and with the recording. But thank you both so much. Thanks everybody for being here. Wow, look at this. We're wrapping up right on time. This is miraculous. But I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your evening. And you can look for that follow-up email probably next week. So thanks everybody and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. You were a great group.
Thank
And I just want
you.
to point out that I did put in the chat my website, which is simply evemanax.com, but my phone number, because really, if you do want to reach me, I'm not going to lie, I'm not doing my emails so very well these days. So please call me or text me. Happy
Thanks,
to
Eve. I'll
follow
send
up
that
with
out.
any questions, even if you think it was crap, like, let's talk.
Yeah.
Thanks for that offer.
Beautiful.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.